Imagine it's 15 November 1923. You're a 34-year-old schoolteacher living in Berlin, Germany. You rent a narrow apartment with a coal stove that smokes in winter and a kitchen so small your wife has to turn sideways to open the cupboard. Your savings sit in a bank book, built slowly from years of skipped holidays, repaired shoes, and careful meals. Each morning you walk to school past shop windows where the prices are rewritten so often the chalk dust never settles. At lunch, you still believe your salary means something, because a salary is supposed to mean security and a bank account is supposed to mean safety. In the pantry, there are a few potatoes, a heel of bread, and the quiet fear that tomorrow the money may still be there, but the food may not. If you have ever wondered why some people come through economic collapse with their footing intact, while others watch the ground disappear beneath them, stay with me. What you're about to hear is not a theory. It is a pattern. It has happened before. And if you find value in this kind of historical clarity, subscribing takes 2 seconds and keeps you ahead of what most people never see coming. Now the turn. By the time you finish class, the mark has fallen again. The shopkeeper wants more money than you carried that morning. Your bank balance still has numbers in it, but those numbers are becoming shadows on paper. The doors of the bank are not always closed, yet the result is the same. The life you stored in savings is leaking away like water through cracked stone. Meanwhile, somewhere beyond the city, a farmer still has rye in the field, potatoes in the ground, and hens that do not care what the exchange rate is. That is what this video is really about. Not land as a status symbol, not land as a luxury toy for rich people. Productive land? Land that can grow food, support animals, or produce something people need even when the rest of the system is shaking. History shows that when currencies break, banks freeze, supply chains fail, or wages vanish, productive land often behaves differently from almost every other asset. It does not just sit there and hope to be repriced. It can keep producing, it can feed, it can trade, it can anchor a family when paper wealth turns to smoke. Collapse is not always a bomb going off. More often, it is a slow tide coming in, covering the floor 1 inch at a time. And in those moments, productive land can become the difference between owning a claim and owning a lifeline. Before we go further, there is something important to understand. The reason productive land can matter so much in a breakdown is surprisingly simple. Most assets are 1 or 2 or 3 steps away from real life. A stock is a claim on a company. A bond is a promise from a borrower. Cash is a ticket that lets you ask someone else for goods. Those things can work very well in normal times. But in a true crisis, the chain between the claim and the real thing starts snapping. The company can fail. The borrower can default. The bank can limit withdrawals. The cash can lose value faster than you can spend it. Productive land is different because it sits closer to the base of the pyramid. If an economy is a house, productive land is not the wallpaper. It is one of the load-bearing beams. It can turn sunlight, water, seed, labor, and soil into calories, raw materials, rent, or export income. It does not guarantee safety. Land can be taxed, seized, neglected, flooded, or ruined by war and bad policy. An empty land is not the same as productive land. A dead field is just scenery. But land that can actually grow something gives its owner a direct line to human need. And human need is the one market that never closes. This is the secret key beneath all the case studies. In stable years, productive land can look boring. It is slow. It is dirty. It asks for maintenance. It does not flash like tech stocks or city apartments. But in unstable years, that same slowness can become strength. A wheat field does not need market confidence to be wheat. An olive grove does not need a central bank press conference to produce olives. Collapse often strips away layers of abstraction. That word just means layers of distance between you and the thing that keeps you alive. When those layers are peeled back, the assets tied closest to food, fuel, shelter, and trade often become the ones people trust most. The crisis does not create that truth. It reveals it the way low tide reveals the rocks that were always there. The first major clue comes from Weimar Germany, because in 1923, the country gave the world one of the clearest demonstrations of what happens when money fails faster than reality does. Germany had already been weakened by the First World War, reparations, trade problems, and budget deficits. Then came the Ruhr occupation in January 1923. French and Belgian troops moved in. Berlin backed passive resistance and kept paying striking workers. To do that, the government printed even more money. Too much money chased too few goods. That phrase can sound technical, but the meaning is simple. More and more tickets were being issued for the same shrinking pile of bread, coal, butter, and rent. The numbers turned surreal. Britannica records that the mark fell to 160,000 to the dollar on 1st July 1923. By 1st October, it was 200 to 42 million to the dollar. By 20th of November, it reached 4.2 trillion to the dollar. DW notes that hyperinflation means prices rising by 50% a month or more. Not 10% over a year, but 50% in a single month. Money was weighed rather than counted. A loaf of bread cost millions. The middle class, especially savers and pensioners, watched their careful lives get ground into dust. A bankbook that once represented years of discipline became little more than a receipt for a vanished world. Ordinary people experienced this not as a chart, but as humiliation. Families rushed to spend wages the moment they were paid because waiting even a day was dangerous. Kathy Kollwitz, the German artist, wrote of storing potatoes in a room rented to a tenant because food itself had become the thing to hoard. Food riots broke out. Barter replaced normal trade. Teachers, clerks, widows, and pensioners were hit hardest because they lived on fixed incomes and stored claims. They held promises. The promises evaporated. Now here is where it gets interesting. Not everyone was hit in the same way. People who controlled productive businesses, inventories, or land had a different relationship to the crisis. A farmer with rye did not need the mark to remain stable in order to possess rye. A landowner with potatoes still had potatoes. A dairy farmer still had milk. Their world was battered, yes. Inputs were costly. Markets were chaotic. Taxes and politics were dangerous. But they were standing on something real. In a storm of paper, they still held substance. And then came the most counterintuitive detail of all. Germany did not finally stabilize confidence by waving gold in front of the public. In late 1923, Gustav Stresemann's government introduced the Rentenmark, a new currency backed not by a pile of coins in a vault, but by mortgages on land and industry. Even D.W. described the idea as a kind of magic trick. And in one explanation, the currency was tied to the yield of agricultural land, the amount of rye a plot could produce. That should make you stop. When one of history's most famous currency collapses had to be stabilized, policymakers reached back toward productive land and real output. In other words, when pure paper had burned itself out, trust had to be rebuilt on soil, crops, factories, and things that could still make something. The lesson is not that every German farmer got rich. That would be false. The lesson is that productive land was on the right side of reality. It was not just a store of value. It was part of the mechanism that restored value in the first place. Money was a mirror that shattered. Land was one of the objects still standing in the room. This brings us directly to Argentina, and the second part of the story is different in style but identical in structure. Here is something I want you to think about before we go further. If your bank account were suddenly frozen tomorrow, what would matter more in the first month? The number on the screen, or your direct access to food, shelter, and something you could sell? Drop your answer in the comments, seriously. Because what I am about to show you next is the part of this pattern that most people never hear. And it changes everything. Argentina's crisis did not look like Weimar at first. It looked modern. It looked respectable. It had bank branches, currency pegs, IMF programs, and all the language of financial management. But beneath the polished surface, the beams were already rotting. By the late 1990s, the economy was sinking into depression. Capital was leaving. Unemployment rose above 20%. Then, on 31st December 2001, came the Corralito, the infamous bank freeze. Withdrawals were limited to $250 a week. The aim was to stop a run on the banks. The effect was to trap millions of people behind their own savings. The BBC later spoke to journalist Karina Echegaray, who remembered that day with brutal clarity. She and her family were trying to buy a flat in Buenos Aires. Then the decree hit. Banks shut their doors. People banged on them with no answer. When her money was finally released later, after devaluation and inflation, it was enough to buy a car, not the home that money had been saved for. That is what collapse does. It does not always steal the number. Sometimes it steals what the number can buy. The country spiraled. Reuters notes that Argentina went through 5 presidents in 2 weeks. The state defaulted on more than $100 billion of debt, and other sources placed the default around $141 billion. The IMF described output falling about 20% over 3 years. Other tallies put the total shrinkage from 1998 to 2002 closer to 28%. By the end of 2002, inflation was above 40%. More than half of Argentines were below the poverty line. Supermarkets were looted. Hunger appeared in a country long proud of being one of the world's breadbaskets. And yet, even in that breakdown, productive land again behaved differently from trapped paper wealth. Why? Because once the peso was devalued, land capable of producing export crops suddenly had a different kind of leverage. That word just means advantage. Its output could be sold into world markets. Its revenue could reprice faster than salaries or bank deposits. Reuters later reported that in some areas, fertile land prices rose sharply after the 2001-02 crisis, reaching around $15,000 per hectare by 2011. Soy products grew to account for more than a quarter of Argentina's exports. High global soy prices helped fuel the recovery that followed. Look at what happened next. Urban savers were trapped behind frozen accounts. Salary earners saw purchasing power collapse. But those connected to productive acreage had an asset that could do 3 jobs at once. It could preserve value better than cash. It could generate real output, and it could plug into external demand. That is crucial. Productive land does not just sit outside the financial system. In some crises, it becomes the bridge back into a functioning one. This did not mean every farmer won. Some were small, indebted, taxed heavily, or squeezed by policy. Some landowners leased rather than owned. Some suffered terrible uncertainty. But the broader pattern held. A working field in the Pampas was not the same kind of thing as a savings account in a frozen bank. One was a claim on a system that had broken. The other was a machine for turning sun and soil into tradable value. When a country's money cracks, the assets tied to globally desired goods can suddenly act like lifeboats on a sinking ship. There's a darker layer too. Crises often reveal that land is not only useful for survival, it is useful for power. In Argentina, whoever controlled productive hectares had bargaining strength that clerks, pensioners, and apartment renters did not. That is uncomfortable, but history is often uncomfortable. Collapse does not distribute pain evenly. It redraws the map of importance. And when it redraws that map, the places that can produce food rise toward the top. The third case is quieter. No wheelbarrows of banknotes, no famous one-day bank freeze. Just a long gray unraveling after the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. Factories stalled, salaries went unpaid, pensions were cut. Whole towns seemed to move in slow motion, like a film where the electricity has gone weak. If Weimar was a bonfire and Argentina was a panic attack, post-Soviet hardship was a winter that kept extending itself month after month. This is where the humble dacha enters the story. A dacha is a small garden plot, often around 600 square meters, sometimes with a tiny house or shed. To outsiders, it can look almost laughably small. Not an estate, not a grand farm, just a patch. But history has a sense of irony. Some of the most resilient land in modern economic history was not vast aristocratic property. It was these modest little plots behind fences. They were lined with potatoes, cucumbers, berries, onions, and fruit trees. The research is striking. A recent academic study describes Soviet-era and post-Soviet dacha gardening as the world's largest example of peri-urban agriculture. It notes that between 30 and 60% of the population in Eastern Europe grows and eats a meaningful amount of its own food. In the specific dacha communities studied, active gardeners produced between 30 and 90% of the fresh vegetables and berries their households consumed. Another report noted that in 1997, at least 38% of Russians supplied themselves with food from dacha plots. Stop and picture what that means. During a system breakdown, millions of families had a parallel pantry rooted in soil. When the wage system failed, the garden still answered roll call. When the state weakened, the beans came up anyway. The dacha was not a hedge fund, it was a pressure valve. It turned collapse from total dependency into partial self-command. Ordinary people talked about these plots with the language of relief. The study records gardeners describing the dacha as podspory, help and support. To them, it was not an asset class. It was the thing that made the month survivable when salaries did not arrive. Some families bought only bread in shops during the growing season and got much of the rest from the garden. In towns hit by layoffs and shrinking pensions, the dacha became a second economy built from jars, seeds, compost, and family labor. The dacha was tiny, but it cut out multiple layers of fragility at once. No bank approval needed, no employer needed, no supermarket markup needed. It shortened the chain between work and food until the chain almost disappeared. That is why productive land can be so powerful in collapse. It is not always about becoming wealthy. Sometimes it is about refusing to become helpless. There's also a surprising moral twist here. In normal times, the dacha could look backward, almost embarrassing, like a relic of hardship. Modern people were supposed to want offices and malls, but when the system cracked, the supposedly backward thing became the advanced survival tool. The forgotten skill became the relevant one. Collapse is a brutal teacher. It often marks yesterday's inconvenience as tomorrow's advantage. And this is where history gets uncomfortable. The people best positioned to use those plots were not necessarily the richest. They were the people with access, know-how, and family networks. Resilience was not only about ownership, it was about capability. A field is like a violin. In the right hands, it makes music. In the wrong hands, it is silent wood. Productive land mattered because millions still knew how to make it sing. Most people will never know what you now know. Most people will keep trusting systems they do not understand. If you are still here, you are not most people. Hit subscribe. Now observe what all of these cases have in common. Weimar, Argentina, post-Soviet dachas. Different countries, same mechanism. In each case, paper claims lost reliability faster than human need lost urgency. Banks could freeze, but people still needed to eat that day. Productive land sits at the intersection of value and necessity. It is both a store and a source. It can preserve purchasing power better than cash. It can generate real goods when normal distribution systems crack. Money in a crisis is like ice in the sun. You watch it disappear while still holding it. In all three cases, land also interacted with confidence. In Weimar, trust was rebuilt by anchoring money to land. In Argentina, land earned through exports.